All right, so in this video, I'm going to talk about the third chapter in On Liberty, chapter called On Individuality. And here, it's going to help to give you some background on Mill, both personal background and background on his other philosophical works. One in particular, a book called Utilitarianism. To start with the personal side, and also why it's important, Mill was sort of the genius of his age. Now, England had a lot of geniuses, right? The 1800s was a good time for England. They were hitting on all cylinders, scientifically in particular. Not a lot of great, or not the sort of height of literary production that maybe England had reached before, but still, in the sciences, going great. But when it comes to philosophy, and also when it comes to social science in general, Mill was the great genius of his day. He is the only great economist in England from really David Ricardo on to much later figures who are operating in the 1870s, 1880s. He is the foremost logician of the 1800s in England. He has a work called The System of Logic. And he is by far, as we talked about, the great political philosopher of English-speaking philosophy of the 19th century. And this was not a surprise. His father, James Mill, was an economist of not nearly Mill's stature, but of some importance at the time. He's no longer read anymore. And also an early psychologist, an early developer of a view called associationism in psychology, which was sort of the dominant view within psychology in the English-speaking world for a long time. When John Stuart Mill was born, his godfather Jeremy Bentham was made his godfather. Jeremy Bentham was the leader of what would come to be called the utilitarian movement. John Stuart Mill would be the one to name it that. It was a philosophical movement. It was also a political, social, and cultural movement. Bentham himself was primarily interested in political reform and in reforming the criminal justice system to make it less brutal and cruel and to make the political system more democratic. And Bentham and James Mill, John Stuart Mill's father, got together and they were like, we're going to raise this kid. We're going to set up a system of education so that this kid's perfect. We're going to put into practice all our sort of psychological speculations about what kind of psychological effect various kinds of upbringing will have on people. And he's going to receive the most thorough and intensive and extensive education possible. And this, for 18, 19 years, was a great success. There's all these stories about Mill where he is he can read French, German, and English by the time he's 3. He was translating Latin when he was 5 or 6. He wrote the index to one of his father's books on, I believe, economics when he was 8 or 9. Meaning he read the whole book and understood it enough to know which concepts were important enough that people would want the index, want it to be in the index. If you think about yourself at 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, that's not something you'd be able to do, right? He was, by the time he was 14, already publishing papers in the most important journals of the day. And journals back then, now journals are things only academics read. In fact, they're often just called academic journals. But back then, they were read much more widely. When you think of a journal, you should think of something like a news magazine of today, like something like The Atlantic. or Harper's or the New Republic or something like that, only a lot thicker and a lot more substantial intellectually. And John Stuart Mill was writing in journals by the time he was 14, writing short essays. And all of this was going great. He was sort of being set up to be the leader of the utilitarian movement, to be the perfect utilitarian himself. Every aspect of his education had been tightly controlled. What he had been exposed to was tightly controlled. Mill said before he was like 18 or 19, he never once listened to music or read poetry. He never spent any time contemplating or like even consuming art. Because his father and his godfather thought, no, we're going to make him into sort of the perfect reasoning machine. We're going to make him into the person with perfect habits to show that utilitarianism is the right way to go. They were sort of creating John Stuart Mill not only to lead the utilitarian movement, but also to be the perfect example of what a utilitarian should be. And everything was going great until he got to be 18 or 19 and he had a complete nervous breakdown. And he went off for like a year to just read poetry in like Scotland. Now, when he came back and started getting going again, he didn't abandon utilitarianism. He would go on in his, I believe, 30s or 40s to write a book called Utilitarianism. And he is recognized by pretty much everyone now as the most important utilitarian historically. Classical utilitarianism was defined by Mill, even as he started breaking away from it. But he did start breaking away. Mill came to think that some of the doctrines that his father and godfather believed in were wrong. Probably the most obvious one was that they thought only pleasure is valuable, and that pleasure was just a matter of like how long and how intense an experience you enjoy is. Bentham was famous for saying pushpin is as good as poetry, and I don't actually know what pushpin is, but it was supposed to be like some stupid, simple game that like poor people played, especially poor children. And Bentham said like pushpin's as good as poetry, meaning there's no better or worse way to spend your time as long as you're enjoying yourself. What Mill came to decide was that that was wrong. What Mill came to decide was that there was more to life than just having the greatest amount of pleasure possible. Now, this was, for a lot of utilitarians, a fairly significant break with tradition. And the reason I'm telling you all this is that you need to understand, I think, a little bit of Mill's background to interpret what he's saying in the chapter on individuality. When he's talking about the necessity of freedom for genius, when he's talking about how oppressive it is to not make up your own mind on things and just follow what previous generations have told you to do, he's speaking from experience. He's speaking as someone who had to break free from the fairly oppressive and rigid lifestyle his father and his godfather tried to force on him. He's talking about someone who didn't do anything before he had his breakdown except for reproduce in a slightly more clever way the things that his father and godfather already had argued for. It wasn't until after he broke free from them, he started doing things like reading poetry and listening to music and stuff like that, and like looking at art and reading for fun rather than just to learn new information. It wasn't until after that that he was able to produce any of his great works for which he is now famous. So Mill has a particular outlook shaped by his life and how it went. The other great influence, I think, on what he has to say in this chapter is Harriet Mill. Harriet Mill was John Stuart Mill's wife. He met her when he was fairly young, and she was, I believe, a bit older, but not much older. But she was married to a much older man when they met. And they immediately started spending all their time together, so much so that it became a scandal. John Stuart Mill was the subject of a social scandal because he was spending like every night at Harriet Mill. She wasn't Harriet Mill yet. They would eventually get married. At Harriet Mill's house. And people were basically just saying, yeah, they're having sex, right? And this was causing problems with her husband, who the problem Harriet Mill's husband had was that Harriet Mill was like way smarter than him, and he knew it, but he didn't like it. So he just decided to not spend any time around her because it was kind of embarrassing for him to be so outclassed by his wife. And so she just spent all her time with John Stuart Mill. Now, it's actually probably unlikely that they were having a sexual affair. Harriet Mill's children, or one of her daughters, she had no children with Mill, ended up reporting that she was pretty sure the two of them never like were physically intimate ever, even after they got married. But he was the subject of a social scandal, and not only that, but that's something it's important to think about when you take account of the fact that he's writing these things about how destructive social pressure and social opprobrium can be. He's been the victim of it. Not only that, though, John Stuart Mill became convinced, he says in large part because of Harriet Mill, or Harriet Taylor, as she was at the time, he became convinced of what we now call liberal feminism. He became convinced that women were the intellectual and sort of spiritual equals of men, and that as a result, all of the laws, but also all of the social conventions that got in the way of women exercising their intellectual and spiritual capacities needed to be done away with. He ended up writing a book called On the Subjection of Women, which is often claimed to be one of the first works of feminism. It's not. There were works of feminism earlier than that. Mary Wollstonecraft was writing feminist works in the late 1700s. And there were kind of feminist works before then too, in the Renaissance and in the Middle Ages. But what happened with Mill is Mill might be the first man to come out and say, hey, yeah, sexism and patriarchy are bad. And this was for the time, right? Like if he hadn't already been a social pariah, he was going to be a social pariah because of this. Mill was someone who advocated an extremely sort of countercultural lifestyle, basically a lifestyle in which he treated his wife as his equal. And he would go on to write that she should really be considered the co-author of all his books, because, as he said, all the best ideas came from her. She never wrote herself. She was not a very healthy person. She died not long after they got married. They knew each other for, I think, like 20 years, and then they got married, and she died like 4 years later. It sucks. But Mill was, for the time, a sort of cultural radical. He was someone who had sort of suffered the pain, suffered the harms of society sort of just coming down on him all at once. Like everybody in upper crust English society, which he was a part of. His father was fairly well off. He was a major political and intellectual figure. So he was part of the upper crust. He was part of what we would now call the 1%. But they all came down on him. They all said like, oh, John Stuart Mill, he's the worst. Get a load of him. He doesn't even beat his wife. Right? And this is part of how you need to interpret what's going on in the chapter on individuality. John Stuart Mill is arguing for nonconformism in some of the most direct ways that have ever been written down. He's saying not just that it's okay to not conform. He's saying it's positively good not to conform. Society needs nonconformists, or else society just degrades. Another thing to keep in mind before I get into sort of the details of the chapter is something I already brought up a little bit. His disagreements with his father and his godfather on doctrine. His father and his godfather believed in something called, and I already briefly talked about this, quantitative hedonism. Hedonism is just the view that pleasure is the only good. What you mean by pleasure here is just experiences you like having, experiences you prefer having, right? Psychological experiences you prefer having. Mill was raised to be a quantitative hedonist. What quantitative hedonism means is pleasure is the only good. And duration and intensity are the only measures of pleasure. Shrink this a little bit. This handwriting is terrible. In fact, I'm going to stop this and rewrite it. Okay. So quantitative hedonism says pleasure is the only good thing, and duration and intensity are the only measures of pleasure. So if you're comparing two pleasures, the only ways to compare them is to figure out which pleasure is better, is to ask, well, how long does the pleasure last? And how intense is it? And that's it. Nothing else matters. Qualitative hedonism is still hedonism, so it says that pleasure is the only good. Oops. But it disagrees with quantitative hedonism by adding in quality, which is why it's called qualitative hedonism. Mill said, some pleasures are better than others, not by being longer or more intense, by just being of higher quality. And when he said, he actually gave sort of conflicting accounts of what made one pleasure of higher quality than another. But sort of the most sensible account he gave was that one pleasure was higher quality than another when it used your intellectual capacities. Why? Because human beings are intellectual creatures. It is part of our nature to use our minds to guide our behavior. And as a result, pleasures that are the result of intellectual activity are better and of higher quality than pleasures that aren't. So he would disagree with Jeremy Bentham, who said pushpin was as good as poetry. And Mill would say, no, pushpin is not as good as poetry. And that's why it was so messed up that you only gave me pushpin. He probably never played pushpin, but he certainly never was allowed to read any poetry. Now, why do I bring this up? Because it plays a big role in his defense of individuality or nonconformism or sort of deciding for yourself how your life will go. The way to interpret on individuality is that it is a full-throated attack on conservatism. So the conservatism of Edmund Burke, someone who said the proper attitude to take towards tradition is that it is the only guide to what will make people as a whole happy, what will make a society flourish. And on individuality, the chapter, chapter 3 of On Liberty, is basically just Mill's response. And what Mill thinks is no. Tradition is a source of evidence, right? So the fact that people have lived a certain way for a very long time is some evidence that it's good for people. But that doesn't mean it's good for everyone, for one thing. It's not evidence that it's good for everyone, just the fact that people have tended to do it. At most, you might think it's evidence that it's good for the majority of people, but not necessarily everybody, because maybe the majority have been forcing a minority to live the way they do, even though it's not good for the minority. Right? But also, it's just not the only source of evidence about how people can be happy. The best source of evidence is by observing how people live and how it works for them. And even better than observing how other people live and seeing how it works out for them is to try things out for yourself. And this is what Mill's talking about with On Individuality. He thinks there is an incredible diversity among people. He compares it to being fit for a coat. He thinks there's more diversity of sort of temperament and character than there is diversity of body types. And he says, but like no one would try to buy clothes unless they were fit for them. And this is a little insight into how things were in the early to mid 1800s. Mass-produced clothing that was made at different sizes didn't exist yet. That actually had to wait till the American Civil War. The American Civil War was the first time that a country had to, or that really any society had to, produce a lot of clothes and a lot of shoes all at once for people who had very different sizes. And so in the process of doing so, they came up with the idea of shoe sizes and clothes sizes and things like that. But this is, I believe, written in the 1840s or 1850s, before that had happened. And so in Mill's day, if you wanted a pair of clothes that fit, you had to go to a tailor and get them to make them to your size. Or at the very least, measure you and try to find something they'd maybe already made that would fit. But Mill thinks when it comes to temperament and character, there's even more diversity than that. So remember, at the end of the last chapter, we talked about what the sources of diversity are. Mill seems to think diversity is just natural. It's not something that has to be encouraged. And he thinks naturally people have diverse temperaments, diverse characters, which means there are diverse ways of life that will work for them. What works for one person to make them happy, to give them a life with high quality pleasure, won't work for another person. And the only way to know what will work for you is to look around and see what things other people have tried and try some of them out for yourself. Or to come up with your own way of life that is sort of unique to you. And this is something Mill spends a great deal of time on, because this is what he's talking about when he's talking about genius. He's talking about the small minority of people. And here Mill is expressing his sort of deep pessimism about the intellectual and emotional capacities of most human beings. He thinks there's very, very rare people who are capable of doing more than following tradition, or even following the examples of other individuals, which are two very different things, by the way. And Mill thinks much better of trying out different ways of life that you're aware of. He thinks much better of that than tradition. Basically, following tradition is for Mill the worst thing possible when it comes to not only making yourself as an individual happy, but making society happy. This is why I'm saying this chapter represents an attack on Burkean conservatism. And this is really where liberalism and conservatism really part ways. I'll get back to that later. But Mill thinks even better than trying out lots of different lifestyles for yourself to see which one fits, the way you would try on a bunch of different coats to see which one fit nicest. Even better would be to be the kind of person who makes your own lifestyle, who doesn't follow others and in how they've lived their lives to see which lifestyle that's already been tried works best for you, but to be the kind of person who comes up with a whole new way of living. These are people of genius, people who can imagine original and therefore new ways of doing things. What Mill says is these people are the source of basically all human progress, especially social and moral progress. And the only way you get them is in a society characterized by a very broad freedom. Not just freedom from the government, but freedom from the oppressive potential actions of other people. Right? So free from people who whisper behind your back that you're having an affair with Lady Harriet Taylor. Free from people laughing at you and excluding you from from society at all because you have the temerity to suggest that maybe women shouldn't be treated like cattle. This is what's on Mill's mind. He thinks of himself as one of these geniuses. And to be fair, he knew how to speak and read Latin and Greek when he was 5. So, there's something to it. And so freedom, if we go back up here, is important not only because it allows people among whom there's a natural diversity, right? Not only because it allows people to find their own lifestyle that fits them best, but also because it helps produce genius. Right? So we have sort of two arguments. And I want to be clear here. Here we're talking about, in chapter 2, we were talking about freedom of expression. In chapter 3, we're talking about a kind of freedom of action. In particular, the freedom to organize your life and live your life the way you choose. There are 3 broad reasons that Mill gives to support that kind of freedom, not just to speak your mind, but to, live your life in accordance with your beliefs. One is that there's natural diversity. And only if people are allowed to live as they choose can people find the lifestyle that's right for them. Another is freedom promotes genius, which is, after all, where all those different ways of living that sort of normal, mediocre people choose between come from, right? If you want to have a chance to live what is for you individually a happy life, you, Mill thinks, fall into one of 2 categories. Either you're a genius or a mediocrity. If you're a mediocrity, sort of the best you can hope for is to find a way of life that other people have already developed and find the one that works best for you. The worst thing you could do would be just to, live the life your parents wanted you to live the life your community wants you to live, let other people make up your mind for you. But if you're even going to go as far as choosing between different lifestyles for yourself, which Mill thinks you have to do, right? Because that is you using your intellectual capacities. Right? Remember, you can't have high quality pleasures unless you're using your intellectual abilities. Mill thinks if you're deciding how to live by just following what other people do, that doesn't require any intellectual effort at all. Your whole life is characterized by having no high quality pleasures. Nothing really good ever happens to you because you're just following like sheep. But if you're a mediocrity, the best you can really hope for is to use your intellectual abilities to identify different ways of life and try them out for yourself. This is something that people naturally do when they're young, right? You've done it yourself. You're college students, right? You've probably gotten to college and experienced things that you didn't experience back at home. And you're trying to figure out, well, what works for you and what doesn't. Right? I remember when I showed up in college, one of the first things I decided was I really don't like getting up in the morning. And I really like staying up late at night. As you can maybe tell from the screen, it's 2:30 a.m. and I'm not anywhere close to going to sleep. But when I was in high school, I had to go to bed at like 10 because I had to wake my ass up at 6 so I could get ready and like walk to school. Well, once I found out that you didn't have to do that kind of thing, I changed the way I lived. You get mediocrities who the best they can hope for is to choose between different lifestyles they become aware of. They require people of genius to blaze those trails for them. But that's not the only benefit of genius. There's also social progress. The only way society as a whole, not just each of us as individuals, but the community improves is by genius. Right? That is, and here we unfortunately get into the racism. You might have already noticed, especially in chapter 2, there's a fair bit of anti-Catholic bias and verging on bigotry in Mill. This was entirely common among Englishmen. It wasn't really fully legal to be Catholic for a long time in England. And it wasn't legal for Catholics to vote when, like, John Stuart Mill was born. The anti-Catholic views in England were very strong. But if you thought the anti-Catholic views were a problem, wait till the end of this chapter when you find him talking about how the entirety of the East is just awful. They used to be great, and now they suck. Why? Custom. Mill thinks of China especially as what happens when a society becomes obsessed with following custom. China is, in Mill's mind, the argument to be made against Burke and his conservative views. Because he says you'll end up like China, a once great place that's now been superseded, ruled by savages. He says like really, really, really tough stuff. Now, you should not walk away from this class and this book thinking that John Stuart Mill has any idea what happened in China. It is true that for most of human history, China was significantly more advanced than the rest of the world, technologically, economically. But the idea that, oh, all of a sudden that stopped, and the reason it stopped is the Chinese became obsessed with their own customs. This is Mill, a man who never went to China, couldn't speak Chinese, didn't read any Chinese works, didn't know anything really about Chinese culture. This is him just listening to people who came back from China. Mill did have firsthand experience with India, and unfortunately, that firsthand experience didn't lead to any less racism. Mill had tons of racist stuff to say about India. But to get Mill's point, it might help to sort of separate what he's saying from who he's saying it about. Not because Mill didn't actually have racist beliefs. Mill had tons of racist beliefs. It was the 1800s and he was a white guy in Europe. He had racist beliefs. But you can use his example of China not as a real way to understand what happened in China, but as you can almost treat it like a hypothetical example. What would happen, Mill thinks, to a society that stifled genius because it forced everyone to obey custom? Mill said it would stop progressing. It would go from being the greatest society on earth to being among the weakest societies on earth. And if you, as long as you don't take what he says about China to actually be true about what happened in China, like what happened in China, it was incredibly complex. And it was not a simple matter of the Chinese becoming obsessed with custom. There's actually no real evidence that they were any more obsessed with custom or less obsessed with custom in the 1700s and 1800s than they were when everyone agrees the Chinese were just like way out ahead of everybody in like 1000 AD. So if you separate it, if you don't take Mill's word for it that this is what actually happened to China, you can still learn something from his example. Because what he says is a society that stifles genius by preventing people of genius from living as they choose to live will lose all its social progress, and it will become weak, and it will become poor. And this feeds right into his utilitarian views, right? So if you want a justification of freedom, Mill's provided you one that doesn't rely on any natural rights. He says freedom produces genius. Genius produces progress. Progress brings everybody along. Right? Even the stupidest person in England has benefited from the work of men and women of genius who have brought the English from being a marginal power within Europe, which was a marginal place in the whole world system, to being, in the mid-1800s, by far the richest, most powerful place on earth. Why? Because the English had freedom. A freedom he fears is going away. Mill seems to think there's this natural tendency for societies to acquire great wealth and advancement, and then to sort of lock itself in place by becoming so pleased with itself that it refused to change. And he claims he could see this already beginning in England. He could see the beginning of the end of their age of progress. And this book is supposed to be an argument against that. So we have, between chapters 2 and 3, a defense of freedom of thought and expression, and a freedom of action, and let's say, and lifestyle. And remember, these are supposed to be freedoms that people enjoy, not just against the government, but against other people. So that what Mill's effectively arguing is that you should not, as an individual or as a member of a group, try to force other people to live the way you think they should live or want to live. If they decide to live in a certain way, you should leave them alone. Why? Because if society goes around forcing other people to live in ways that the individuals don't want, you're going to stifle genius, which is going to stop social progress, and you're also going to stop the naturally diverse people, right, everybody's different, that idea, you're going to stop people from finding the way to be happy. Custom is for Mill. The enforcement of custom is basically the perfect way to make a society unhappy, weak, and poor. And so this is, a significant assault on conservatism. And I said that it's around Mill where you start seeing liberalism and conservatism separate. If you go back to Burke and you compare Burke to Locke, there are differences. Locke is really into talking about natural rights, and Burke is very suspicious of natural rights. Locke is very, very interested in liberty as a value that supersedes all others. And Burke is like, well, liberty is an important value, but it's not the only one, and we shouldn't push it too far. So while there are differences between Locke and Burke, there's also a lot of similarities. Burke thought of himself as a liberal, along the same lines as Locke. He would have thought of himself as a Lockean, at least sort of a moderate Lockean. You don't get a significant divergence between liberals and conservatives until after Burke. I mean, think about it. Burke sort of develops conservatism in response to the Age of Revolution, the American Revolution, which he was initially in favor of, and the French Revolution, which he was against from the beginning. But of course, the French Revolution was something liberals ended up not liking either, because a lot of them got their heads chopped off during it. What happens is you start getting liberals moving in the direction of a much more expansive kind of freedom than Locke suggested. There's nothing in Locke about people being left alone to live their lives as they see fit. That's just, I mean, it's probably something he would have agreed with, but it's certainly not a focus. And to the extent he would have agreed with it, he would have just said, well, if you're on your own property, you get to do what you want. Right? In the end, it would have all come back to property rights. Notice that nowhere in the defense of freedom of expression or freedom of action and lifestyle has Mill ever made reference to private property rights having anything to do with it. Mill's attack on custom marks, I mean, it's not like it started with Mill. Mill's sort of presenting the best version of a way of thinking that had been developing over time. But once you have Mill, conservatism and liberalism are definitely distinct views, views that are in tension, and views that to some extent you have to choose between. In a way that Locke and Burke, you don't so much. Burke is a conservative twist on a fundamentally Lockean view. Or a view that a Lockean could have been comfortable with. Okay, so there's 2 more chapters. I'll see whether I can combine those into one video rather than separating them into 2, but we'll see. But this has been the end of the video on the chapter on individuality.